in the later part of the 14th century, in about 1360 or so, there lived a landowner called Wayach, in England in the area currently known as Cheddar, who came into possession a singular sort of servant. Of course, servants of this time were of a different sort of importance than servants as we know them today, but this servant was especially peculiar, mainly for the reason that Wayach did not have any servants assigned for the one that mysteriously appeared in his workshop one afternoon, long after tea. Wayach's eldest daughter was the first to notice the presence of the new man, and first having thought him a customer, though, in all honesty, a queer sort of customer he would make, and an even queerer servant as she would soon discover, and informed him that Wayach had departed ahead of his family for Mass. Cold Tom, as he would ask to be called, looked up from where he was sitting at Wayach's workbench and told the girl that he was Wayach's servant, and would be living with them for whatever period as Wayach saw fit. And thus Cold Tom came to live with the Wayachs. Cold Tom ended up being a curious breed of servant, something of a combination of butler, footman, coachman, and general man of business. Mr. Wayach consulted Tom for a great many things, much more, his family thought, than he should have ought to. But then, Tom always had a curious sort of pull around him, not least of because of his rather strange appearance. Tom was rather tall, and excessively thin, and his too large head was swamped with a great mass of downy blonde hair. His face was half over with a strawberry mark he claimed he had since birth, and contrasted wildly with his eyes, which twinkled a blue-green, and stood out in the night, like pinpricks of St. Elmo's fire. But despite his strangeness, Tom was never disloyal to Wayach, and did his very best to serve the man in everything. His only fit of temper came when he destroyed a pot laying carelessly upon his hand by Wayach's daughter Margaretta, both of which were long and thin and fragile, and no one could hardly fault him for being cross. Then, on the morning of April 4th, in the late part of the 1360s, Mrs. Wayach came home to find a cabinet in the kitchen where no cabinet had been before. It was, Tom explained when she asked, a magical cabinet. He had thought, he explained, it very cruel of Mr. Wayach not to grant his wife a restful place to stay instead of working all day. He had often begged Wayach, he explained, to be more forgiving to his wife. Mrs. Wayach wanted to know where the cupboard led. Oh, to a magical place where all care was lifted from your shoulders, and as long as you stayed, you could live in complete and utopic happiness, and that Mrs. Wayach should see for herself. Mrs. Wayach did not know what utopic meant, but asked if her husband knew of this. Cold Tom replied that but of course he did, and seeing the errors of his ways, had asked Tom especially to find it for Mrs. Wayach. Oh, then it was all right then, said Mrs. Wayach, and went into the cupboard. A total of 137 people disappeared into the cupboard that afternoon, never to be seen again by any English man or woman, including Mr. Wayach, his middle and youngest daughter, the nurse, 8 of his neighbors, most of the town's children, the parish priest, and several of his brothers and sisters. Only Wayach's eldest daughter, Mary, did not go in, and told the king's men, when they were informed of the matter, what had happened. My father entered some time ago, to try to persuade the people to leave the cupboard. He has not come back out. But of Cold Tom, no trace could be found. And I must not omit to say that in 1914, an archaeological dig was conducted in the northern part of England, on the craggy coastal region, on what appeared to be the site of a town of prehistoric origin, where the team members found, under 2 stones laying against one another, stairs leading down into the earth. In a subterranean room of about 20 feet long by 16 feet wide, They found over 100 corpses, all bearing markers of having lived nearly some 600 years ago, all sitting with their knees drawn up to their chins, and their arms wrapped about their legs. Aside for the sheer scale of bodies found, and the curious positions they were found in, the only thing the archaeological team could not account for, however, was the apparent recentness of their deaths, which, to all intents and purposes, was only several days beforehand. An excerpt from a 1920 children's book titled An Impasse at Warwickshire, and Other Tales of Impossible Truths. Sadly, only a few copies of this book remain, probably. I was only lucky enough to find a copy amongst my grandmother's old things in the closet upstairs. Author of this tale is Arthur Holmeswick.
2009. Just graduated high school. Going camping with friends to celebrate. Camping in an abandoned church house, that is. Church itself is spooky but basically an empty building. Is a very small formerly Baptist church which has a reputation around town for being haunted. Typical fare, graffiti, pentagrams etc. The church house was where it's at. Old two-story wooden house built in the 20s connected to the church. Overlooks old graveyard. Ultimate spook setting to drop acid. For us, all retarded, all very high on acid. Wandering around the house with candles. We had flashlights in our pockets but candles are spookier. It's hitting hard, I'm seeing spirals and fluctuations in the dark. I see a figure. Is it an illusion? No, it's too real. Anyone who has done acid knows that it's not like in the movies, your perception changes but you don't see like dragons and full-on hallucinations. Figure walks up to me, it's a black girl who looks my age. She's wearing a dirty nightgown kinda thing. Maybe just a really big men's dress shirt, I don't know. Titties jiggling under the thin fabric shits cash. Stutter out a hey. Totally confused, tripping balls. She pulls out one titty. Think that's weird, just one, but okay. She pinches her nip. It starts making a sound like when you pinch the end of a balloon while the air is coming out. I can fucking feel the breeze of air escaping her titty. Her body deflates and falls on the floor. What the fuck? Am weirdly not affected, probably the drugs. Regroup with friends, don't mention it. Go back and look in the morning. There's a huge pile of hair on the ground where the woman deflated. Never do acid again.
This reminded me. B17. In a cabin. Enjoying the peace and quiet, hunting and shit. Shoot Bambi's mom. It's getting dark, so I drag the corpse into my shed for next morning. Go to sleep. Woken up by the loudest fucking crash. A bear or something probably smelled the blood. Grab my shotgun. Load it with slugs. Go downstairs. See the shed doors completely obliterated. I'm young and stupid, and I'm thinking I'd quite like a bear rug. Grab flashlight and go outside. Hear something feasting upon that poor deer. Bones cracking, meat ripping, etc. Shine the light in the shed. Blood and pieces of the deer are all over the floor and wall, and in the center of it is the creature. That's not a bear. It turns around and notices me. It's hunched down on four legs, but it definitely has hands. It's covered in gray/white fur. It's got a wolf's head with yellow fangs and eyes. It's got blood stains all over it. It tenses up and growls at me. I shoot from the hip. The slugs hit its shoulder. It howls in pain. I fucking leg it back inside, while it's stunned. I want to get the shit out of there, so I call my dad and tell him everything. He's coming to get me out. The thing eventually comes out bleeding and limping. Then it just stops, and looks at me straight in the eyes, growling. See some headlights. It sees them too, howls, and runs off into the woods. I grab my shit and we drive the fuck out of there.
Help me explain this 1/X/ took place about 15 years ago in the forests of Northern California while on a Boy Scout trip. About 10 years old at the time. We ran out of tents, so they decided that the smallest people would all have to cram in one. Fit 4 people in a 2-person tent. I was put on the edge, so couldn't sleep for shit. Kept checking my watch every so often while I just sat there listening to crickets. 11:30 p.m. Behind our tent in a giant bush, probably off tall and too thick to see through. Start hearing shuffling sounds in the bush behind us. Slowly starts getting louder and louder, as if it's slowly making its way toward our tent. I try my best to imagine it as a raccoon or something, but I can't stop fixating on it. By now it's so close I can tell it's making its way toward our tent. I'll begin to panic. Try waking up the guy next to me, but he won't move. I can hear a combination of rustling and footsteps so clearly it's something big. LT emerges from the bush and is standing directly behind my head. The sides and front of our tent were filmed so could see outside, but I was so frozen with fear I couldn't move. Hear the thing start to walk beside the tent, brushing against it as it walked past me. Now I can tell it's just standing right in front of me. Still too frozen to lift my head to take a look outside. A few minutes pass by with no sound. Check the watch again. 11:47. Just as I check the time, heard the most terrifying screech of all time. Almost sounded like a woman screaming, but also like a big cat fighting for territory. Instantly rock my head up to look, just as I hear and barely see a figure run off into the woods. Feels like forever passed until I heard another sound. 12:50. Hear scratching sounds off in the distance. Almost like tree branches are being torn off. Spent the rest of the night on high alert waiting for something else to happen. In the morning I'm the first one up. As soon as I walk out of the tent I see the footprints probably 2 feet from our tent. Actually looked like a dinosaur or giant bird footprint. Pick related, closest I could find. Footprints started from the bush behind the tent, which was completely hollowed out. Prints led to the edge of the woods, which were too hard to track. Started looking around for a while until I found something. Probably 50 feet out there was one tree that was completely destroyed. Thick branches were completely snapped in half. The trunk of the tree had scratch marks all over it, similar to what the footprints looked like. I told everyone about what I experienced over the night, and everyone just said it had to have been raccoons. Raccoons? I thought maybe a bear or cougar based on the tree damage and screech, but the bush was hollowed out too high and the footprints were so different.